Welcome to the PI Podcast, Political Insights for the Palaging Inis. I'm your host, Matt, and with me is my co-host, political scientist, meme lord, and currently on the short list of the referee for the debate between Justice Carpio and President Duterte, Borj.
Referee. Puta. PI nyo, PI nating lahat. Board here at your service. It's gonna be, nilipat na eh. Si si Salvador Panelo ang gustong lumaban.
Oh, wow. Sige. It's a substitute. Oh, good. Best of luck. Hope you get in, So you'll be an interesting referee. But for today, actually, it's been a while since we had a long episode. Our last one was with Father Fiel. So, that was sanctified. But ever since, we're going to do something different, But yeah, that was one of our best episodes. Yeah, very difficult to edit. Yeah, but we've been actually very busy, not necessarily on our long form podcast, but other people's podcasts. We've been guesting on them, actually. You remember our collaboration with, what's his name?
Yeah, with White Stripe.
White Stripe podcast. So we guested on the White Stripe podcast. The host is actually one of my former students, Trey Remulia. So yeah, he's one of the good ones, actually. And I think he really, really pried into what made us tick,
that was an uncensored episode. So yeah, great.
Very uncensored. So if you want to see a different side of us, a different or backstory or origin story that has not been expressed in this podcast, be sure to check out his channel. You'll also be able to enjoy a lot of other content. He interviews mostly, sometimes celebrities, influencers, artists, musicians, etc. So
you had a gig the other day.
That too. One at a time. But So besides White Stripe, I personally also guested in a student org podcast, the Late Talks. And we'll send a description in our show notes down below. So please check them out. They have really good stuff. They talk about very important social issues as well. We talked about youth participation and youth politics and empowerment. Basically, that podcast is about a lot of advocacies by legal management students and beyond. So that's very interesting. Check that out. But for today, we have, in a way, culminating what have we been discussing in other people's podcasts, which is basically a different side of it. Of course, we talk about political participation a lot and civic responsibility, civic virtues. But now let's look at it in a different light. Like, when is it okay, for instance, to be neutral or neutrality? Because a lot of have you ever encountered that word these days, especially in social media, Borj?
Yeah, I think people have an allergy for political neutrality at this point, so it is very interesting. And of course, we will not stop talking about civic virtues in this podcast. So political neutrality is a topic that we would eventually end up with, and now we are here.
Right. In what context do you find that word eventually? Yeah.
Whenever someone tries to say that don't politicize everything. And I think that would be, I think there's a piece of news that you shared regarding that one. The former stewardess from Cebu Pacific.
From Cebu Pacific.
A TikToker. Yeah. I think a TikToker who showed her pride with pictures of Harry Roque with her, so on and so forth. And people started to bash her. She said sorry, if I'm not mistaken. Then eventually it ended up with that phrase, don't politicize everything. And I think she was criticized for being apolitical. So I think that is something that we can start with. What's the distinction? What is the difference between being apolitical and being politically neutral?
It's very different. One thing can be possibly ethical and a good thing. The other is inexcusable. Now, why is that?
I think being apolitical is inexcusable, not because of any civic moral values per se. It's simply stupid. First and foremost, you can only be apolitical if you live in an island surrounded by monkeys. But even at that point, probably the monkeys would have their own polis and you would be a part of it. But it is impossible to be apolitical. And it is inexcusable because when you try and say that you're apolitical, you're either lazy in thinking or you have biases that are unexamined unexamined. You just hide behind this notion of, I don't care about politics. It's like saying that you don't care about the place that you are in or the society that you are in.
Right. So it's quite unavoidable whether you like it to or not. And to try to is actually inexcusable because, funny thing is that we kind of sympathize her on one hand, saying that not everything can be politicized, but on the other hand, she also tries to be apolitical, So,
Mm.
and a lot of people like taking a picture with Hariroke, he's considered a villain by a lot of people. In fact, even Father Fiel mentioned that he cut in line in front of the normal people, he just treated like a VIP. And he's hated by the people, and to celebrate his presence in the flight is a little bit, people find that offensive,
Mm.
So, and here's the thing, we've discussed before several times, this is probably the most politicized youth population, or even like society we've ever been.
Mm.
And everyone is on a bundle of nerves. And
Mm.
so just an inkling of being neutral or even apolitical is triggering for a lot of people.
Mm.
It causes a stir. In fact, she was pilloried and criticized by multiple, like, it's viral. It became viral.
Mm.
And it was a bit, so we wanted, but to a certain extent, the reason why this kind of bothered me is that I have to admit, in certain issues, personally, I am neutral. Okay, to be apolitical is to, correct me if I'm wrong, to refuse to take a political side, whereas a political neutrality is to not to side with anyone in a conflict or
Yeah,
in a
wait, wait, wait.
struggle.
Well, regarding
Yeah.
that one, I think apolitical is about being deliberately unconcerned with politics. It's not about taking sides or whatnot. It's just being unconcerned with politics. So,
Right.
and I would like to make an addition. This current condition of our society right now, not only are we politicized, that is one point, but we're
Right.
also polarized. And I think we are concerned with polarization rather than politicization. So, yes, being apolitical is about not deliberately not being concerned with politics. You're trying your
Right.
best not to be concerned with it.
Actually, let's go back to neutrality. There are actually two main definitions. The first one I kind of mentioned is a state of not supporting or helping either side in a conflict or disagreement. Or number two, the absence of decided views, expression, or strong feeling. So that's actually interesting. It's the absence of decided views. So, in other words, you have not made your mind in a certain issue. And I think that one is at least defensible. And that's what we're going to discuss today. So why is political neutrality necessary? Perhaps not all the time, but it is necessary, in certain situations. And, can it be a good thing? We'll explore that today. Now, before we defend neutrality, I think it's fair to respond to the common misconception, arguments.
Let's say dictums.
Or the canned arguments thrown at people being accused of being neutral or apolitical. And let's start with the one. And the thing is, this one is actually one of my favorite authors, Elie Weisel. He's a Polish author and academic. He's famous for writing the Night trilogy, particularly based on his experience in the Nazi death camp. And he said this in particular. So, we must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at the moment, become the center of the universe. Now, what do you think about this quotation?
Okay. Regarding that one, we need to take it as a whole, first and foremost. So usually they cut off with the conditions on when you should interfere. And what did he say? The second half of it, you should interfere when human dignity is at threat. So this is already an expression of a political value, which I have nothing against. It's a valid political value. So we need to take that. So neutrality, okay, does it necessarily help the oppressor? What about publicly expressing your opinion? What about being politically active? In a society wherein activism itself is part of the system, wherein it is the negative. I'll lay it down. Probably my response would be, if you would relate this quotation with activism and try to say that activism is sacred, my argument, this would piss off so many people, which I am happy to do. I say that activism or failed activism, ineffective activism, I'll be very specific.
Right.
Failed activism, ineffective activism are the best sources of legitimacy for a tyrant. Because such activities would show that resistance is futile. And whenever it happens, whenever it repeats itself, whenever a protest happens and people go back home, nothing effective occurs, the protesters didn't influence anything. The spectators, which I do to an extent to represent those who watch, and we are the majority, those who watch would more or less say, shit, expressing public opinion doesn't matter. And that is pinned down, and that is sustained. So whenever that event is repeated, whenever there's an ineffective public protest, yes, they express their opinions. Did it affect the system? And this is emphasized in a very pragmatic society that judges anything based on effectiveness. But again,
So in that sense, taking a side does help the oppressor rather than, fight him. That's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
But take note that this actually adds, let's say, moral judgment in those who claim to be neutral. So if you don't say something, then you're automatically on the side of the oppressor. You're hurting us all. You're dooming us by not joining us. So I think that is again I find it unfair moral judgment on the people saying neutral. Because of course I think I understand what Elie Weisel is trying to say. Like when human life is at stake, when people are dying, you must take a side and you must be a part of the people that fight it. But at the same time, what happens when, like what you said, what if it all fails and you wasted your, of course, reputation, but sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes people lose their life. And I think to some people to say that's cowardice, at least you fought, but not all people can afford to make such an investment or a gamble. And here's the thing. I think one thing that we have to say, political activism, taking a side, should be an act of freedom. You cannot force people to take sides. And that's what I'm always against.
Nor can you castigate them if they don't side with you.
Right.
That's one thing. And let me ask, probably relatively tangential, but still related.
Sure.
Are there only two necessary sides in any issue?
Well, that's an interesting point. In this kind of question, there's usually, he always puts it against the oppressor and oppressed. And this is in a way a tool for people to get you on their side. It's like, if you're not, like, they'll come for you as well. So you best fight for your freedom and your rights now with us. And I think that's the problem. It gives you a sense of urgency, and it actually, in a sense, prevents people from thinking. And I think this, for me, this is why I'm, in a sense, in favor of neutrality, because it gives you a position for you to think and consider multiple sides and multiple perspectives. And like what you said, there are multiple sides for everything. It's not just oppressor and oppressed. What do you think? What are the other
that's the thing. This thing regarding political neutrality. Personally, I'm against it to an extent. I know its value. But there's a difference between fence sitting and using neutrality as a way for one to examine the other relevant sides of the same picture.
Right.
So, but then again, we need to recognize that the weight of this quotation. There is much moral baggage behind the words oppressed and oppressor. Okay, there's much moral baggage to it. To an extent that I, agree with it. But the principle of taking sides, can you apply it to all political issues? Can you apply it to all political issues? So,
well, I think this quotation is, in a way, deployed in critical junctures. In other words, where the sides are clearer than in most ways. Like when you're in a state of civil war, you're in a time of revolution, for example. When they're trying to get, when the revolutionaries are trying to boost their numbers, they say, "Are you with us, or are you in a way against us?" And that moves to our next one. But that's the danger there. And
That's
I s-
that's very
yeah.
frustrating. That's utterly frustrating to an extent. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it is politics is by nature reductionist. It
Mm-hmm.
reduces issues into yes or no, pro or con, oppressor
Right.
or oppressed. That is part of
Mm-hmm.
nature of politics.
Mm-hmm.
But uh, I am weighed down by the responsibility of a thinker. And a
Uh-huh.
thinker, as a thinker, as someone
Right.
in a position to think, we have the
Mm-hmm.
responsibility to look beyond dichotomies. And
Mm-hmm.
it is very difficult, really. It's difficult
Right.
to try to see the value of political neutrality. It is lazy, it is cheap to have an opinion at this point.
Mm.
You know,
Oh,
it is cheap to have an opinion.
right.
And this, it is difficult to not only suspend opinion,
Mm.
but to further analyze
Mm-hmm.
a situation, to see a perspective that is more or less that is also important, yet not bound by the dichotomy of pro or con. For example, I'll just say that the perspective of the spectator, which I
Mm.
proudly embody, the
Mm.
perspective of the non-voter, the perspective not
Uh-huh.
of the apathetic, but those who are discontented with the entire system. So you have pro and
Mm.
con. You have pro admin, anti admin. You have opposition. You have administration. You have leftists, and
Mm-hmm.
then you have the government. But
Mm-hmm.
we, the majority of spectators,
Mm-hmm.
where's our voice? Are
Mm-hmm.
we are should we just be cajoled by people to have to take a side when in fact we see something beyond these dichotomies? We see that the entire system is shitty, ranging from the activists themselves to the government.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So there are
Mm.
sides. There are sides to a certain issue that are repressed
Right.
for repressed for the sake of sustaining a dichotomy.
Right. I want to push you a bit on that. You know,
Mm,
you said you were in a position of a thinker, and you're right. Like, it's your responsibility to expose multiple perspectives. What about the regular citizen, the regular Filipino?
mm,
How would they don't have the same, I suppose, resources or time
yeah.
to consider such. How do you think? How do you think they should consider that? You know, like how will they avoid being neutral in such a situation
Mm.
if they
I
don't have the time to think? You yourself said that they not
yeah,
everyone has the time to
yeah,
think.
yeah. I think no. I think this is by fact that they will take sides first and
Uh huh.
foremost. So it is inevitable for them because they don't have the resources to think further, which is something that I can. It is something that I will not dare excuse, but it is as it is. It is as it
Mm-hmm.
is. I
Right.
accept that fact. I accept that fact. I
Uh huh.
work with that fact.
Right.
What I cannot excuse would be those with the time and resources to think further, yet end up
Okay.
parroting
Mm-hmm.
slogans.
Right. Interesting.
Have you met
Actually,
any of those people?
parroting slogans. That anyone with, I think that's the point of anyone who shares a meme or who shares an article and just say or fuck Duterte or Duterte pa rin, you know, either way. Um, but I think for me, it's much. I just realized it's actually much simpler. Um, for Duterte, of course, has failed, but of course, the opposition has also failed because they have failed to fully understand the failures of Duterte articulating the people. They didn't reach out to the people. Remember, in 2019, the Ocho Derecho coalition that went against Duterte,
Mm,
they they failed miserably despite Duterte and his administration clearly performing badly, even much worse now. But yeah, not as
mm,
but still bad.
mm,
Um, in a way, because they simply, you know, the two sides that are emerging in the social media right now, they're not like they don't speak for everyone.
mm,
There is, and my simple thing is try to articulate their own observations or their own opinions that they don't necessarily fall on
mm,
either side. I think that's like, to in a way people need to learn to value their own observation and their disconnect between the two main sides.
mm.
So that's, and for people who claim to be speaking for the oppressed, I was like, okay, have you talked to more people? Do they all agree with you, or do they just like parrot your memes, share your memes, and parrot your
Mm.
slogans? Yeah, do they really fully believe it, or is there something that you are failing to articulate or do you understand their side, or do you
Mm.
just claim that to understand their side, speak for them? Yeah, I share that frustration as well. But there
Mm.
is a sometimes there is a side that's not between both sides. That's yours.
Mm.
So they don't necessarily speak for you. It's up to you to decide actually if they do speak for you or not. And you have to think. That is
Mm.
a clearly like two sides don't speak for me. But I'm able to articulate my own side, and
Mm.
it's in a way a third way. It's not necessarily detached, but it's something else, and I think
Yeah.
that's what we should encourage.
But I think one question that I do have, it just popped
Hmm.
out. Is there such a thing as your own side?
Hmm.
Is there such a thing as your own side? I find that
Hmm.
relatively impossible. What do you think? Is there such a thing as your own side?
Mm. Well, sim- simply put, if you care about your own survival, then you can just choose not. It's close to the people who try to be apolitical. But what I mean to say is like something that is a product of my own thinking,
Mm.
that is, I don't want to say independent or free, but at the very
Mm.
least, objectively crafted. It's objectively made through my own process of thinking with data that is weighed against each other,
Mm.
etc., etc. So at least it's not
Or
based on your connection to either side, but
mm.
simply on the facts and judgments available to you and your values. Judge
Mm.
it against people's values. That's what I think. Just to be
or
dangerously, move away
or
from
or
a
yeah,
political. Yeah,
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 yeah. We'll move away from apolitical. That is inexcusable. So we'll just focus on
right,
neutrality. But okay, let me add. Do you agree
right.
that when you say your own, it's not necessarily in isolation? It will never be in
Of,
isolation.
of course,
But is self criticism a part of it?
of course, yeah.
So
I think that's the responsibility of thinking.
mm,
Before you take a decision, try to attack it. Say, in what sense are we wrong? And then we talked about the episode
mm,
3. So in a way, you can't just say like it's not based on your own biases. Definitely, you
mm,
have them, but you have
mm,
to be prepared for the arguments against them. And if it still
mm,
stands, you keep it and
mm.
strengthen your own arguments for it.
Yeah,
So it's yeah. So
and
it's not based on
that's
simply
yeah.
relationships with the sides,
Mm,
but simply a product of thinking,
mm.
which more people should do.
More or less self-critical thinking, which is
Sure.
again, partially I don't agree with be just being based on data or analysis. It's
Right.
fine. But it's not the entire picture. But I think what is crucial would be this capacity to criticize yourself, because you can also have data and analysis and still support a bias. That's basically cognitive bias in a
Sure.
nutshell. You have data,
Sure.
you have information, you use it
Mm-hmm.
to more or less buttress your own biases. But this
Mm-hmm.
capacity to self-criticize, this capacity to, as Mao said, wash your
Mm.
face regularly,
Uh-huh.
this is
Mm.
necessary to have a quote unquote own
Mm-hmm.
own judgment, own decision. And I think this would also be one of the lynches
Right.
in Nietzsche's examination of the genealogy of morals. How
Uh-huh.
can man free himself from society? It's not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
having your own idea per se, but it's
Oh.
having the capacity to criticize your own
Mm-hmm.
beliefs, having the
Right.
capacity to criticize your own beliefs. And I will level this against the old left right now. Are
Right.
they actually practicing Maoist self-criticism effectively? Because I think if they
Oh.
if they do practice it effectively, then they would see how ineffective they are. But I don't think they
Ooh.
are. I don't think they are. I don't think the old left in the Philippines is practicing self-criticism effectively. Because if they
Right.
do, they will see things that I have seen, which is basically them losing,
Uh-huh.
being
Okay.
thoroughly impractical.
That is a leftover from our last slice of my, check that out as well. And when I say my own, it's not like, of course, like I said, not in isolation or like it's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
different from everyone else, but it is simply a product of your own thinking. You can own up to it. It's personal, but at the same time, whether if it's if you end up siding with something else, as long as you
Yeah.
have it's aligns with your convictions, that's completely fine. If it resonates with you, then sure, as long as you
Mm.
thought about it. It's just don't let people emotionally or morally blackmail you into joining their side. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah. That,
yeah,
that that is great. That is great. Don't let them
uh,
emotionally blackmail you. But the thinking is a bit still too vague. So I think, would you
sure.
agree? Would you agree if we can specify it to self criticism? Because that is a bit
For
more utterly specific to criticize yourself.
for for now, I think we can,
Mm.
but I think that's a subject for another video. And I think
Yeah.
perhaps maybe a PS well about
Yeah.
paano mag-isip
Yeah.
or how to think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How to think? Yeah, we should have that one. But going back to what I said earlier, having an
Mm-hmm.
opinion is cheap.
Right.
And you know why it's
Mm-hmm.
cheap? Because it is
Mm-hmm.
expensive to criticize yourself. It is
Right.
difficult to criticize yourself
Mm-hmm.
properly, not nominally. Yung mga usual
Right.
na, I was wrong with this, I was wrong with that, without going deeper into your own values and biases, into your own,
Mm-hmm.
what we call, habits. That's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would pin it down. Self-criticism should not only be directed at the results of your activities,
Right.
but it should be directed at your habits. What do you
Mm-hmm.
have, your habits in thinking, your
Mm-hmm.
habits in basically your behavior, your practices, your strategies, your tactics. Habits, I think, should be the target of self-criticism.
How do you do that? Can you give an example?
Well, for example, if you are employing a destructive coping mechanism
Mm-hmm.
and you're used to it, you should ask
Oh.
yourself, why am I used to it? And why am I not happy being used to it?
Uh-huh. Like, why do you smoke or drink or
Yeah, basically that.
watch porn?
Yeah, basically watch porn or
Yeah, like why?
why is it
Yeah.
not producing I
Please don't use the
intended
word
to.
produce. Okay. Go. Anyway,
Okay, political habits. Political habits. Be more specific.
political habits.
Let's just say
Uh-huh.
that if you decide to speak in such a manner, if you decide to post slogans on your Facebook posts regularly, repeating
Right.
other people's
Yeah.
repeating other people's slogans, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But then again, criticizing, self-criticism must be anchored on values
Uh-huh.
that are to an extent above you, really,
Mhm.
because you cannot. For example, it would be ineffective if you would simply judge yourself based on
Right.
your own standards, because you would always
Mhm.
pass.
Okay.
Anyway, that's a bit too complex. So let's go back to political neutrality.
Yeah. Yeah. We keep them as tangents here, but okay.
Yeah.
Well, talk about slogans. I think people are fond of that. It's
Hmm.
on T-shirts, it's on stickers, it's on memes, and it's a short form for like saying allegiance or like saying that you care
Hmm.
about the poor, you care about women, you care about minorities, etc., the indigenous people, etc. But I think this is one thing I said in my guesting on Lay is like,
Hmm.
in a way, have you earned the right to say those things? Do you understand? Have you experienced walked a mile in their shoes? Have you talked to anyone?
Hmm.
Have you talked to the people you're speaking for? Do they have your approval for speaking on their behalf?
Hmm.
Like, for instance, you may disagree with this, but I know people who speak for like the Lumans, but have they ever like talked to a Luman? Like, have you ever talked to people who are get outraged about trans people, what people say about trans people? But do you have a trans friend? Have you
Hmm.
talked to them about it? Do you know how they feel about, say, what J.K. Rowling has said?
Hmm.
So yeah, it's like have maybe like really part of having like a personal relationship with your thoughts is to actually experience that issue for yourself, not just use it through the lens of what other people have said about it, because clearly they're out there to try and convince you and perhaps even control you. Not just like the media or like political parties, but even civil society.
Yeah.
So be careful. So
yeah, be careful. That's why, personally, as I mentioned a while ago, I can only speak with confidence on behalf of the inactive. Because I have
Okay.
spoken with them, I have studied them, I am part
The
of them.
inactive.
We are
the
the
patron
inactive.
saint of the inactive. We are the inactive. Nous sommes inactifs. Anyway,
we are this group of people who knows that this entire system is more or less bullshit.
Right.
But then again, I think we think, no, for the inactive, I think the people inside the system are bullshit, but not the system itself.
Ooh. All right. Too many hot takes. Too many takes. Let's move on. Okay, but yeah, that's great. Let's move. I think we have a few more here. And the next one, I think we've already talked about it, is if you're not with us, you're against us. And this is actually based on a biblical quote. I think it was I'll double check. It's like, he was not with me is against me. Even Mussolini has said it, like in Italian, like, if you're not with us, you're against us. And this is usually in like what's the word, used and deployed in times of war. So in a way, there is no time for thinking.
Mm.
There, if you choose not to take a side, the enemy will get you. You know, that's related to the previous one. But
Mm.
also, not only that, it's not only your side, but you're also harming us. In other
Mm.
words, your silence is killing us. That's similar thing. You're, if not with us, you're against us. In other words, if you do not agree with me, you are not my friend. You are an enemy. And in a way, this is harks back to what we talked about in episode 3, you know, about
Mm.
disagreements.
Mm.
So in other words, if you don't agree with me, you are a threat. That's not always the case. You know, I mean,
Mm.
you and I share a lot of different opinions with a lot of people, but
Mm.
I don't think we're a threat. You know, do you
Mm.
agree with this statement? You know,
No,
how,
no.
yeah,
If you're not with me, you're against me is one of the most recent bullshits that I've been.
it's old, but not
Yeah, it is
re-
old, but
yeah,
it's always
yeah,
repeated, so on and so forth, in various ways. It can be repeated discreetly, or it can be repeated explicitly.
right.
It's used to persecute
Mm-hmm.
people. It's used to persecute people.
Mm-hmm.
But you know,
Mm-hmm.
taking sides. No, I remember one thing regarding this one
Hmm.
that I would like to share. The movie All Quiet on the Western Front. So I
I
would
don't know that
recommend
one.
people to watch it, but they try to watch it.
Oh,
But it's the black and white classic would be nice.
oh,
There
okay.
was well, one of the soldiers, one of the old sergeants in the unit of the protagonist. He's a soldier. He's
Mm-hmm.
fighting, but he is not siding with
Mm-hmm.
even his own country. He
Right.
finds the patriotic rhetoric as bullshit to an extent that he
Mm-hmm.
said this in. I think they were having a break. They were having lunch. I think, and he said
Uh huh.
he proposed that we should just
Mm-hmm.
place all the leaders of the world and put them in a pit and let them fight each other.
Oh, what?
That's what he
Okay.
said. So no more wars. Let's just put all the leaders in a pit and let them fight each other to the death. And as a
Right.
soldier, that's the thing. This reduction of issues into two sides was never the. The other example I can think of would be Lenin, curiously,
Right.
because Lenin saw, of course, the imperialist side of this First World War, and
Right.
this imperialist side is something he explicated not by taking any
Uh-oh.
side, but by
Right.
transcending dichotomies, transcending the Russia versus Germany dichotomy. He said
Right.
all wars
Mm.
are imperialist wars. So
Mm-hmm.
all
Mm-hmm.
imperial wars are capitalist wars. It's just basically workers fighting against each other, and this is
Right.
juxtaposed with his counterpart in the
Mm-hmm.
when the Tsar fell. It was replaced by
Right.
the provisional government. Was headed by Alexander Kerensky.
Yeah.
Kerensky, even if he's quote unquote a socialist,
Mm-hmm.
he remained within that dichotomy. That's why he continued to persecute the war, even if
Right.
the Tsar fell.
Right.
So there's always a
Mm.
side. There's always
Mm-hmm.
there's always a perspective that looks at the entire affair as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very interesting because based underlying that, I think it's based on this long idea that most wars in history were on the whims of like a select few people,
Hmm.
of the leaders, heads of state, and of kings and queens.
Hmm.
That and the thing is, the people had nothing to do with it. It's just if the king or queen gets pissed off, they declare war and they fight people that had nothing to do with the reason for the war to begin with. And
Hmm.
there are also other people who try to think that, oh, this war that I think it concerns everybody.
Hmm.
But and here's the thing, I know we said that no one is apolitical,
Hmm.
like as long as we're part of society, we are political. But I think this is an important question we should always ask: is this war my war?
Yeah.
And you have to understand that. Of course,
Hmm.
the answer usually points to yes in some way or another. But is it the way that it's being framed?
Hmm.
It's still your war.
Hmm.
Is the war between DDS and Dilawan your war? Is it a war between? I think, of course, the COVID war is all our war. That's
Yeah.
definitely a thing. But all other things. So what do you think about that?
But yet, you're correct. That's a question that everyone must ask without jumping into conclusions.
Right.
If you have the capacity, if you have the resources, if you have the time to think
Mm-hmm.
thoroughly about that question, then you must. Even
Right.
if you end up with the same conclusion, even if you say, yes, fine, it's my war. But in that process, you would have a clear understanding of why. And you
Mm.
may open up possibilities you may open a perspective saying this may be my war, but it's not being fought
Right.
in a way that I would have found more appropriate. For example, this war between Dides and Dilawan. This is my war as well. I mean, I'm against Duterte, but my opposition to Duterte is not and will never be aligned with how the opposition right now frames it.
Right.
Because
right.
I have an understanding not only of the roots of his popularity, not only the roots of his political support, but also the limitations of the opposition, as well as the stinking rotten piece of garbage we have as a government. So
yeah,
that view is more encompassing.
I'm trying to remember this one thing. I think there is a lot of like people try to put that moral question to a lot of people, like this to fight for your country. I think both sides, they say, oh, if you're against us, you don't like your country, you're unpatriotic. In fact, this question was done. I remember it, Mark. I think I've said this before. Mark Twain. He's an author, but he is commonly spoken against the colonization of the Philippines. Because here's the thing: it's like we have no business being in the Philippines. Why are you there? And most people went against him, saying you are unpatriotic. It's like my country, even above all else, even if it's wrong, like. But it's like, but I think this is an important thing. It's also an act of freedom just to say no, just to say no. This is not my war, Yeah, and you have to know this because I think I mentioned this in both like the guestings. We are always in a 24/7 cycle of like, oh, you have to take a side on this, take a side on that, and it's also it saps your energy. So you have to know when to rest and when to recharge, and also when to think about it and say, why didn't you like this post? Why didn't you share it? It's like, does that mean you hate children, or does that mean you hate our country, or something like that? Does it mean you hate the poor, or something like that? So it's like, no, I just don't have all the facts. So I suppose, I think that's one thing important to consider. You have to be, at least before you get into a war, quote unquote, you also have to be armed. You have to arm yourself. You have to know how to fight. You have to know how to wield your facts, your principles, your values.
Yeah. I do agree
Which
with
I
that
suppose which goes to the next
wait.
question.
Regarding that one,
you have anything else for this one?
Yeah, last one.
Right.
I think I've made a post about this on Facebook
Right.
regarding this, yung Gerald Tarog speaking via General Luna's character when he said that Bayan o Sarili, mamili ka. And that is a false dichotomy. It's a good line because it's thoroughly reductionist. And that's what rhetoric, that's what activist rhetoric would always try to do. It's thoroughly reductionist. Bayan o Sarili, mamili ka. And people would say, but this was done in a war. This was done in a conflict. In a conflict, you must choose between yourself or your country, and you must choose your country. Well, a real entity by the person of Pericles during that's a real entity, not a fictional character.
Yeah.
During the Peloponnesian War, when they were at war with the Spartans, they were under siege. And he was urging Athenians to continue fighting, and his argument is thoroughly different with that Bayan o Sarili by a semi-fictional character. Which again, I detest that term. When I first heard it, I said, "Wow!" But when you come to think of it, this is bullshit.
Ooh,
it is bullshit. This Bayan o Sarili dichotomy should end. It should end fast. It should end now, because
so how should we think?
For Pericles, I would paraphrase Pericles. He said to the Athenians, without your welfare is tied with the welfare of Athens. He united personal interest with public interest, and that is how it's supposed to be. That's why that's how you can convince people to keep on fighting, not to sacrifice themselves as martyrs, but to secure themselves by securing their country.
Right.
And that is an angle that I think would convince more people, but is being repressed by this dichotomy of Bayan o Sarili. So false dichotomies repress valuable perspectives that could have worked in different ways.
I think JFK said it better. It's like ask not what your country can do for you, but you can do for your country. So if
No,
there's a relationship,
I think
not even.
JFK's quotation. That's the prototype of that false dichotomy.
Okay. What
That's
you
the
can do for
prototype
your
of it.
country. Okay.
No, it must be a unity. It is a troubled unity. It is difficult to achieve, but it must be like that.
I actually made a similar post also. It's like, okay, mahal mo ang bayan, pero mahal ka ba ng bayan? So
Well,
yeah,
that's the shadow of it.
yeah.
That's the shadow of it.
So in other words, it should also, in a way, bring you personal joy. You know what personal joy can bring you to give something to your country. You have to know that continuity. You cannot separate that. In other
Yeah.
words, your country succeeds, you succeed because you live in it. That's a basic thing. Yeah,
It is. You cannot ask ordinary people to sacrifice themselves. You just can't.
a continuity.
Yeah, there must be a continuity between the self and the society, the polity, and that is something that this false
Great.
dichotomy breaks.
Okay. That's interesting. Let's move on to the next one. And
Yeah.
I think this is very common. So we both established the importance of thinking beyond two sides, the importance of doing facts, checking your own biases and opinions. But the problem is they have this thing called paralysis by analysis. In other words, you spend too much time thinking, eventually you're there forever. And I think I remember a scene from Lord of the Rings when everyone is fighting, the orcs and the men and elves, etc. The trees or the ants. I think J.R. Tolkien is frustrated with academia. This represents academia because the ants were talking. What should they do? And for hours, and everyone was dead, and almost. And then they said, "We've decided you are not orcs." So yeah, like, but what about? Are we going to fight? Are we going to fight? And it's the context of war again. So I think that was a criticism on thinking. So, and I completely agree. Like you can't think forever, So at what point should we stop thinking and say, okay, let's join the battle? What do you think about this?
This is tricky.
Paralysis by analysis. Yeah.
This is tricky, this is tricky. But the answer lies in the process of thinking itself, because when you start criticizing yourself, when you start checking your own values, when you start checking your own biases, you would eventually know if you can be empathetic, if you can actually empathize with people, if you can actually feel the oppression that people are suffering from. And I don't have any easy answer for this. I will not. We all have our own ways to know when to stop thinking. We all have our own ways, but I think it's also about, because I cannot answer it directly. Another would be by thinking you establish priorities on one hand, establish your priorities. On the other, it actually depends on your own values again. If you actually value society, if you actually value other people's lives, then that would direct your analysis to things that can be more effective, that can actually provide goods to people. And it's also difficulty that I'm facing right now. I'll think.
Yeah.
If you have any answer, go ahead. I'll try to come up with an answer to that one.
Are you being neutral?
No. I'm suspending judgment. I'm suspending judgment.
There you go. Yeah.
I'll come back.
It's hard, You might. Yeah. I mean, sometimes you just don't have enough information, so it's very difficult. So I suppose we usually fall back on our default positions, which are sometimes status quo or something, or sometimes one or the other side, even though you have doubts. And the thing is, there are I think what you're trying also to say is there are some doubts that you can in a way suspend. It's a bit of a gamble, actually. There are some situations where you have to gamble. You don't know everything. You have to accept you don't know everything.
Yeah.
So you need to, if you were to gamble, what chances of it? If you make this choice, what chance of it would benefit your conscience and your values and your country? You have to take all that into consideration and gamble. It takes courage to, in a way, take a position. You have to think, but also at the same time, to the point where it should be combined with courage. I think it's one thing you have to make clear. We're not advocating for neutrality as a veneer for cowardice. If you're afraid to take a side, that's not it. You just have to think before you create to take a side.
Yes.
But don't use thinking as an excuse for your cowardice.
Yep.
So yeah.
Yeah,
I suppose.
I think you nailed that in the head. You nailed that in the head.
Thank you.
I would add. Okay, I found the answer right now since you mentioned that.
Okay.
One. I'm trying to get that out of the way before I present my answer, which is thank you for giving that one. Yes, it is based on your own personal courage. It is a gamble, but I think what neutrality or what this time of silence provides a person is to answer an equally important question, which is how will you participate? How will you engage? And this is a question that you cannot answer easily, lest you end up following other people's orders, lest you end up supporting the system itself, even if you think that it's not. For example, if knee-jerk reaction is to conduct a public protest, again, as I've said, failed and ineffective public protest sustains a system. Yet your knee-jerk reaction, even if you're courageous and even if you're brave, but you lack thinking on such practical matters, your knee-jerk reaction would simply sustain the system itself. So an equally important question would be, it's not only about when you should participate in politics, but that is determined by your own sense of courage, but it's also the question of how. Can you participate in a way that is outside the box? Can you participate in a way that is actually effective? Can you participate in a way that can actually create something new, even if it is a small one? Can you plant a seed that would grow into a tree instead of merely repeating this endless cycle of people failing to influence politics and the majority watching them fail? So it's a question of how as well.
Right. And that takes real reflection on your current circumstances. Like, are you just repeating what has been done before? And that's what I think that's what a lot of the Filipinos know. They are aware of the failures of opposing the regime. There are people dead because of that. That's why it's a real threat on their lives. So
people must make those lives count.
Right.
I also add one more thing. Question of why you're participating. Why are you participating in politics? People may be deluded by their own sense of self-righteousness without having a clear understanding of why they're actually participating in politics. There's also a question of why. So when you examine your values, when you examine your own moral compass, and this takes time, you can answer that question.
Oh, that's a deep question. I'm not sure I have anything to add on that, but it's definitely, why are you in politics? And I think it's fair for you people understand, or maybe why are you not in politics? If you have a proper answer to it, say it's there's also another phenomenon of like just being snobbish about it. Like saying, I am above politics. And I'm like, are you ever above politics? It's too dirty. Yeah. What do you have to say for those kinds of people?
They can go fuck themselves.
Simple as that. Okay. I don't know. Is there any way to speak to that snobbishness?
The snobs, they're always part of society. They're an amusing accessory to human society. So let them be. Have you met any snobs like that who says that they're above politics?
Frankly, I used to be one of those snobs. But really, I think reality would hit you harder and saying, no, you would have to. You're a part of it. You're in the thick of it. Whether you like it or not. And I think it's also a part of their way of coping. They can't accept the reality that society is on the brink. And in a way, you might be able to contribute something. And I think this moves to our last common concern with regards to to taking sides. Like, what if there are too many voices? Or maybe one feels that they're not adequate in thinking or speaking. What can you say? Like, because it's like, ang dami nang nagsasalita sa politika, hindi na ako. That's a common mistake. What do you think?
As far as data is concerned, that is shared by many Filipinos. That they think that politics is too complicated for them. That their voice doesn't matter. That they cannot affect politics. And why do they feel such a way? Why do they feel that they cannot affect politics? Why do they feel that? Why do they perceive themselves as incapable of understanding politics? We go back
Uh-huh.
to their representatives. And I'm not
Mm.
only referring to elected ones, I'm also referring to the self-proclaimed ones who say that they are representative of the people.
Right.
Spectators watch, spectators judge. We have
Mm.
our own set of values. We have our own
Mm.
set of standards.
Mhm.
If those standards are not reached by those performing in public affairs, then we will
Right.
judge ourselves accordingly.
Right.
If they can only see losers in politics,
Right.
people who say that we represent the majority of the people, we represent the poor, yet they see them as losers,
Mm.
then they will more or less, again, there are small successes, but again, small successes must be sustained, as an argument provided by Popkin in his analysis of the Vietnam War. According to him, the success of the Vietnam War was not only about grand victories of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. It was about
Mm.
an accumulation of small successes, small victories, a
Mm.
large accumulation of sustained small victories. And
Ah.
then you have key junctures wherein the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong actually won pitched battles against the French and
Right.
against the United States. But the small victories, I cannot see that in the old left right now.
Uh-huh.
They don't have an accumulation of small victories. What they have are sparse victories way back in time, or sparse victories now that they try to
Mhm.
emphasize. But behind them is a long line, a long standing, first and foremost, a long standing revolt that haven't won.
Mhm.
They're proud to say that we have the longest armed revolt in the world. Jesus Christ, that's more of a
Uh-huh.
failure than a success.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
Mao's protracted warfare only lasted for several years. They lasted for
Right.
decades. That's already an indicator of being losers. But yes,
Mm.
there's no accumulation of small victories. So. But
Mm.
anyway, that's a tangent.
No, I like that point actually. In fact, speaking of starting small, I actually tell this my students all the time. And what I ask them, what bothers you? It's like, oh, Duterte is failure. Duterte is like this. Duterte is that. The anti-terror law, this, and these are like, or these are huge issues, and you can't get at Duterte. Like he is protected by the army and the police, etc. So if you want to change, to make a positive change, like start small. If you can't think of changing the country, since
Mm,
if you look at the country at large in national news, it's always going to be bad news. You'll
mm,
find something wrong. Start with your own community,
mm,
or start with your own city even. That's what I always tell them: start small. And they think it's much more manageable.
mm,
It's only a city, it's only your barangay.
mm,
That's why it's much easier to think in your barangay, because it's small, it's
mm,
easier to manage.
mm,
And so I suppose, and each barangay is different. So sometimes, and there are a few people who can contribute. So if you can contribute your voice to there, then that would be more than enough.
mm.
And then you work your way up. Same way of like,
Even
I
we're
mentioned
even
this.
even
Yeah,
even we're starting small.
yeah.
Even this podcast is our small contribution
This
to let
podcast.
people
Mm,
think in a way that they could not think in ordinary
yeah,
times.
yeah. Like we're surprised that we have actually hundreds of followers, maybe even thousands. So it's like a little bit by bit, you
Bit
know.
by bit.
So celebrate small victories, yeah. And I even mentioned this last time, like the community pantries.
Mm,
It's really only for those communities, and yet it became a template for people to follow.
mm.
So I suppose you'll never know unless you try. So that I think that's one thing. Why do you think you also need the courage to experiment and to
Yes.
try?
Mm.
Yeah.
And
To
regarding that
start
one,
something new.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
regarding that one, I would link it directly with thinking, and this would
Right.
be from a pragmatist perspective. I think I can
Right.
provide a reference for that one with
Sure.
John Dewey or whatnot. But for
Right.
them, experimental pragmatism, for the basis, the basis of experiment is not only about the courage to
Mm-hmm.
take a gamble.
Right.
That's part of it. That's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But for the
Right.
pragmatists, they say that experiments are necessary because that's the only means for you to determine whether your idea is right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
If it's right, it will work. If it's wrong, that means it's not yet applicable for a certain circumstance. Hence, you don't need to abandon it, but it is wrong in practical sense. So
Mm-hmm.
so for them, their standard of whether you're correct or not is based on the
Mm-hmm.
success of your experiment. This is from a
Right.
pragmatist perspective. So
Uh-huh.
it's not only about courage. It's not only
Right.
about courage. It's also about the
Mm-hmm.
nature of truth and right. It is
Mm.
true and it is right if it works.
Yeah. And we only can three thrives three sides to everything: yours, mine, and the truth. The truth is always, no one
Mm,
person possesses the truth.
mm,
So I mean, who knows, maybe you might have a different aspect of the truth. I
mm.
don't want to say this, like the blind people with the elephant, but anyway, something
Eh.
like that for a metaphor. I
Someone already
say,
criticized that one. Really, I need to recover that one for my Polteo class. It's already a false, and
yeah,
it's already a false
uh,
analogy with theorizing.
right, right. The point is, if there's a war, chances the chances are very slim for one side to have all the truth. They're completely
Mm.
right. So think about that. I suppose let's just wrap it up with this question. So how can we be ethically neutral?
Okay, but well, okay. What are the standards? What are the ethical principles that must determine it? Any
Hmm.
idea? Any idea from our discussion? What are the ethical principles that can be used as a principle?
Right. Well, I suppose I'll limit them down to questions.
Mm.
Number one are the sides being fair? In other words,
Mm.
information based on certain are the judgments
Naputol ka.
making.
Naputol ka.
Yeah.
Can you?
Hello.
Hello, naputol ka. Can you repeat that again?
Yeah. Okay. Uh, I'm not sure about values, but these are questions.
Mm.
One, ask yourself: are the current sides fair? Do they resonate with you? That's one
Mm.
thing you have to ask yourself. Na para, oh, how do you say it in Tagalog? Na parang, um,
Patas ba?
patas pa? Okay. No, I mean, like, do they resonate?
Patatas ba?
Patatas. You know what? Let's say, does it make sense to you? Simple as that. Ask
Yeah.
yourself that question.
Mm.
Does it make sense to you? Do you agree with any of the sides? If you don't, then
Mm.
simple as that. Then think about that. Ask
Mm.
yourself why. Number two, is my position fair? Or should I just
Mm.
simply read more? So
Mm.
to be not uninformed is not an excuse to be neutral.
Mm. Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
you should always move towards being informed. To
Mm.
always move towards having a side. It
Mm.
not may not be among the two sides or the main sides, but you can have your own position.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
another question is this my war? And I think this is not all, or
Mm.
this is this my conflict? Is this my issue? Now,
Mm.
of course, it's a political. It may concern you sometimes. Does it concern people you care about? Sure, I don't know. But, it's also partly on, are you qualified to speak? It's a
Mm.
very different issue altogether. But
Mm.
it's a question. So that's how you position yourself
Okay.
in it.
Okay,
Yeah.
fair. Yep. I
And the
think.
last one, I think,
Yeah.
am I
Go.
being cowardly? Cowardly and you're neutral. So if you're
Mm.
neutral, but out of like thinking and of courage, then yeah, that's fine. But if it's out of cowardice, never.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. I think you covered most of it, but
Right.
put it in a more. I'm placing it in a more positive, more
Okay.
non-question form.
Okay.
I think no, based on our discussion, to be ethically political neutral, to the proper way of being politically neutral. First, you
Right.
must be neutral. I see neutrality not as a static condition. It's more of a
Mhm.
resting point, really. You be
Yeah.
neutral. It's just a part of the process of taking a side. It's
Hmm.
it's not necessarily the existing side, and that I think that's a
Right.
great challenge. If you can, that's the ideal. If you can use your neutrality to expose as many relevant sides, to
Hmm.
analyze as many relevant sides to an issue as possible, and then you
Hmm.
create a distinct
Hmm.
a distinct approach to the
Mm.
problem, to the same problem, then I think that is the correct way of being politically neutral. Well, second,
Right.
I would reiterate what you said. You must be neutral out of courage, not out of
Hmm.
cowardice. And this already
Mm.
hit to the balls regarding people who are proud to be neutral. If you're neutral simply because you're afraid to take sides or to be accountable for having a side, then you are a coward and you have no right to be a citizen. You just go to hell. Again, we are tying political neutrality with high civic standards. And I think this is a takeaway for our listeners. We are not here to defend political neutrality as it is. We are tying it with high civic standards. And first, again, you must be neutral. You can only be neutral if you are trying to expose as many relevant sides to an issue as possible. You can only be neutral if you're doing it out of courage. You can only be neutral if I think like I can only highlight those. You can only be neutral if you're willing to take sides.
Eventually, I'll put it this way: thinking is like being on the toilet. It's okay to be there for a while, but if you're there too long, you need to see a doctor.
And probably your mom would shout at you.
Oy, kanina ka pa sa banyo. Kanina ka pa neutral. Happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day. But yeah, pinapalit ako nanay ko pag
Anyway, I suppose that's all we can say about political neutrality. It should never be out of fear, but out of courage. And that's very quotable.
And it should be used to expose all relevant sides to an issue.
Yes.
And ideally to create a distinct side.
It could be yours from your own insight, from your own experience. It's not yours alone, but it just came from your process of thinking. So
but I think that's a more personalist, that's a more individualistic interpretation of it. I'm saying it more as not it being your own per se, because you would eventually share it with other people, but it is a side that is not only well thought out, but have been subjected to criticism, self-criticism. And it is a side that you think can be more successful, that can entail greater benefits than existing
practical
sides.
And realistic. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So now that was a very hearty discussion.
Yeah.
But we'll continue some threads eventually in future episodes.
Yeah.
But for now, let's go into recommendations. Where we go into related material like books, movies, TV shows, works of art, music that can help us digest the topic further. Now, what do you have to recommend this time, Borj?
Oh, yeah. Regarding that one, I've been having a hard time trying to find a book on neutrality. But yeah, as we have discussed earlier on, I'm recommending the movie Man for All Seasons. It's
a good one.
It's a classic. I think it's available on YouTube. I'll find the link. If not, you can just find it on Putlocker. It's a biopic. It's a biopic on Sir Thomas More, the one who stood against King Henry VIII. Not because he's pro or against Henry VIII. And this is something that I would like to emphasize. Sir Thomas More stood against Henry VIII because he stood for the law, which is the third side. The third side that is between partisanship, whether you're pro or against Henry VIII and the Church of England, or whether you're for the Catholic Church. But he stood for the law. That's one thing. And for him, what Henry did was illegal. Simple as that. And this movie also emphasized the value of silence. But then again, the disclaimer. Silence is only valuable if you are in a position wherein you are expected to speak. Okay, so I think we can pursue this in a future episode. But neutrality is usually attached with silence, right? Neutrality is usually attached with silence. But let me say this one. Let me be clear. Silence is only valuable if you are being expected to speak. If you are not expected to speak and you're silent, you are nothing. So that's also one indicator when to speak, really. But
that is wonderful. In fact, I love the scene, especially when he says that he disagrees based on the law, and then it's also said, so would you apply the law to the devil himself? Said, yes, I would. That is powerful. So it's based on principles that is not based on social sides or wars, but simply his own conviction towards the law. And that is courage. Neutrality
Yep.
is courage. So
Yep.
that's great. That's great. It's funny. My recommendation for today is actually two books. I suppose material and someone who actually looks like Thomas More in that movie. Jordan Peterson. He has two
Oh
books.
yeah.
12 Rules for Life, Antidote to Chaos, and Beyond Order. And the reason why I'm recommending this, not particularly because of his politics. His politics is, well, I don't completely agree with it, but it's been interesting because, in a sense,
Mm.
um, most people he opposed he's famous because he opposed Bill 316, which in a way legally mandates people to use pronouns, and he says no, he won't do it because language is something not meant to be legislated, and that's a sense of freedom. It's expressing his disagreement, and people say that, oh, if you don't like this, then you are a sexist, you're a transphobe. He says no, he respects trans people. So it's, in a way,
Mm.
they're trying to paint him as a bad guy, and that's not
Mm.
that's not the case. So that's one. As a person, he's performed a kind of political
Mm.
neutrality, and he presents sides that are different, not beyond the two sides that
Mm.
people paint. And I think his books in particular are not particularly political. People claim that it's like Nazi.
Yeah, I think
It's really,
it is dangerous to
it's
apply Peterson to
sure.
politics.
True. And that's why I wouldn't call him necessarily political, but in a
Mm.
way pre-political.
Yeah.
Pre-political.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. We talked about thinking about public issues and talked about personal values. How can you do that when you don't know what your values are?
Mm.
And in a way, these books have helped people figure their personal values out. It is actually Okay. So what Peterson's saying is not quite political, but it is pre-political. We talked about how you should think about issues based on your personal values. But how can you do that when you don't know what those values are? And these books actually help people figure them out. He doesn't impose them on
Mm.
you. It's simply just telling you, stand up with your shoulders straight, and things like, don't, like in the new book, don't do what you hate. So you have to
Mm.
know, like, what do you hate and what don't you hate? What do you love?
Mm.
And it tells you to focus on one thing. Now, it doesn't tell you what to focus on. It just said you have to figure out, what do you want?
Mm.
And I think these are questions that he poses to people. And when people figure them out, their lives are better. Now, these are personal. Eventually, you have to. A strong personal life is a good foundation for your own political life.
Yep.
And that's what a lot of people forget. People say, "Oh, politics first," politics first. But in a way, before you go into fix the public sphere, in a way, you
Mm.
have to fix your own
Yeah.
values. Clean your room.
I'll, I'll
Start
I'll
with yourself.
I'll add
Yeah.
something. I'll add something to that one. Insecurities create tyrants.
You probably have a dirty room.
Yeah, insecurities
Yeah.
create tyrants. The basis of
Mm-hmm.
tyranny, dictators, is always their own
Mhm.
insecurities.
Right. Oh, yeah. Okay. So it's probably and then it's necessary for them to control everything because
Mm.
they're insecure. They don't know what happens.
Yep.
So I suppose, and I think that's the reason why he can't be a fascist is because part of what his new book says is you have to accept certain things you cannot control.
Mm.
You have to accept that there is suffering, but you have to be thankful in spite of suffering. That's his last rule. And so I recommend you pick up those books or watch his videos.
Mm.
I don't necessarily agree with all his politics, but it's worth considering.
Mm.
So yeah, that is a very full episode 14. What do
Yep.
you think? This is been a
We
while.
need to discuss more. There are some issues that must be discussed. For example, I think question that we can tackle in the future is
Right.
if is neutrality only applicable to two sides? If you take your own side, is it still political neutrality? If you
Well,
take if you take a distinct side, is it still political neutrality?
like what you said, eventually your
Yeah,
side, once shared, can be agreed upon and it
Yeah.
can become a new faction.
Yeah,
But
fair,
again, if
fair.
if you keep it to yourself, it's not political anymore.
if it hasn't established itself, I think
Yeah.
so. There's a degree with that one. Just a clarification for our listeners.
Uh-huh.
So if our
Yeah.
listeners are into strict logic, then yeah, that's a clarification. That
Careful. But anyway, yeah. So thank you for joining us in this episode. Feel free to keep us listening and follow us on Anchor, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, And please send us an email at pipodcastph@gmail.com. Now, thank you for joining us. But until the next episode,
Magandang gabi, mga kabiay.